They grabbed her before anyone could understand why. Fingers like iron closed around the strap at her throat, yanking her forward hard enough that the breath left her lungs in a dry, humiliating cough. The world tilted. The smell of sweat, steel, and cheap coffee filled her nose. Someone barked, "Who sent you?" close enough that she felt his words on her skin. Around them, the room froze, boots stopped moving, conversations collapsed into stunned silence. She did not struggle. That was the first mistake they made. Her eyes lifted slowly, not wide with fear, not pleading, calm. Almost curious, the kind of calm that unsettles men who believe power lives in their hands. He tightened his grip, convinced stillness meant weakness. Her boots scraped once against the concrete floor as he pulled her closer, expecting panic, submission, answers. Instead, she inhaled carefully through her nose, measuring him, cataloging the angle of his wrist, the tension in his shoulders, the confidence that came from never having been tested by someone like her. She had lived her life in rooms exactly like this, rooms where assumptions were made, where respect was withheld, where danger wore uniforms and smiles. The injustice of it pressed against her ribs, familiar as an old scar. Minutes earlier, she had walked in unnoticed. No insignia, no announcement, just a woman in plain clothes moving through a secure facility where she did not belong, according to everyone who saw her. Eyes had followed her with suspicion, some with amusement, a few with open contempt. She had felt it all, the unspoken verdict delivered before a word was exchanged. Outsider, mistake, threat. The irony tasted bitter, metallic. She had trained herself not to react to irony anymore. The man holding her was breathing harder now. He hadn't expected her to be this solid, this grounded. "Answer," he demanded again, voice sharper, louder, as if volume could manufacture authority. A thin line of heat ran along her throat where the strap dug into her skin. Pain registered, acknowledged, set aside. She had learned long ago that pain was information, nothing more. Across the room, someone finally moved. A senior officer took a step forward, uncertainty flickering across his face. He knew the rules. He also knew something was wrong. This situation carried a weight that didn't belong to trespassers or spies. It felt older, deeper, like a test no one remembered agreeing to take. She spoke then, quietly, forcing him to lean closer to hear. "If you don't let go," she said, voice steady, "you're going to regret it for the rest of your career." There was no threat in her tone, just certainty. He laughed once, sharp and dismissive, and that was when the room truly began to change. He tightened his grip again, and in the same instant she moved, not explosively, not dramatically, but with surgical precision. A shift of her weight, a turn of her shoulder, his wrist bent at an angle it was never meant to bend. The strap slid free as his balance vanished. He hit the floor hard, air exploding from his lungs, her knee already planted beside his neck, her forearm pressing exactly where it needed to press to remind him how fragile he was. No one shouted, no one rushed in. The silence was enormous. She rose and stepped back before anyone could decide how to react, adjusting the collar of her jacket with hands that did not shake. The mark on her throat was already darkening, a visible accusation. Her gaze swept the room, meeting eyes that had changed, confusion replacing arrogance, fear edging into respect. "This is a secure space," someone finally said, weakly, as if clinging to protocol might restore order. She nodded once. "I know." A name passed through the room in a whisper, uncertain at first, then louder as recognition spread. Faces drained of color. One man swallowed hard. Another straightened instinctively, as if standing at attention could undo what had just happened. The officer who had stepped forward earlier felt a cold realization settle in his chest. He had seen her before, not in person, but in stories, in classified briefings, in after-action reports spoken about in reverent tones. The woman who rebuilt men after they were broken, the one who had stood in kill houses and oceans and deserts, shaping raw aggression into discipline, fear into focus. She was the architect behind half of them. Memory rippled outward, connecting dots too late, the techniques, the reflexes, the voice some of them still heard in their heads under pressure, calm and unyielding, telling them to breathe, to think, to survive. She had never needed credit. She had never wanted a uniform that would invite salutes instead of questions. She believed anonymity kept the work pure. The man on the floor groaned, shame flooding his face as understanding crashed down on him. He had put his hands on someone who had trained his instructors, someone whose lessons had kept his friends alive. She looked at him once, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something heavier, disappointment. Next time, she said softly, ask before you grab. No one argued. No one dared. Later, as the room slowly returned to motion, the weight of what had happened lingered like smoke. She signed the papers she had come to sign, gave the assessment they had requested, corrected mistakes with brutal honesty and quiet compassion. They listened the way people listen when they realize survival has a face, and it does not look the way they expected. When she finally walked out, evening light spilling across the concrete, the mark on her throat still visible, she did not look back. Respect had arrived too late to matter to her. She had already proven what needed proving, not with force, but with presence. And in the silence she left behind, every man there understood a truth that would stay with them far longer than fear. Power does not always announce itself, and the most dangerous teachers are the ones you never see coming. The silence she left behind was not empty. It pressed into the walls, into the men standing there, into the one still on the floor struggling to reclaim his breath. It carried memory. It carried recognition arriving too late. She stood near the long steel table now, hands resting loosely at her sides, posture relaxed in a way that only comes from absolute certainty. The mark on her throat had deepened into a bruised line, a quiet indictment no one dared comment on. Eyes kept drifting there, then snapping away, ashamed of looking. The air smelled faintly of oil and disinfectant, but beneath it lingered something older, fear mixed with reverence. The officer who finally cleared his throat felt his authority thinning with every second she remained unchallenged. He remembered her voice without realizing it was hers, remembered commands delivered in the dark during training exercises, calm and precise, stripping panic from men who believed they were fearless. Until they weren't, he had never pictured her face, none of them had. In their minds she had been an idea. A standard, a pressure that never broke. She felt the shift before anyone spoke. Humans always changed their weight when truth settled in. Shoulders tightened, chins lifted, spine straightened. Respect, when it arrived suddenly, was clumsy. You shouldn't be here, someone muttered weakly, clinging to procedure as if it were a life raft. She turned her head just enough to acknowledge the comment. Her expression held no anger. That was what unsettled them most. Anger could be dismissed. This couldn't. And yet, she said quietly, you called for my evaluation. That landed heavier than shouting ever could. Memories surfaced uninvited. Men remembered failing drills they thought impossible, remembered her watching from the shadows, never intervening until the exact second intervention meant survival instead of comfort. She had taught them how to breathe underwater when lungs burned, how to think when vision narrowed, how to keep going when pride collapsed. She had seen them stripped to their worst selves and rebuilt them without mercy, without praise. The man who had grabbed her finally pushed himself upright, refusing help, face flushed with more than pain. Shame radiated off him in waves. He could not meet her eyes. His hands shook slightly, as if they no longer trusted him. He had believed power lived in dominance. He had been wrong, she noticed. She always noticed, not to punish, but to understand. Fear makes people careless, she said, not to him alone, but to the room. Assumptions get people killed. No one argued. No one moved. The injustice of it all pulsed beneath her calm. The years of walking into places where her presence was questioned, challenged, tested in ways men were never tested. She had accepted it long ago, not because it was fair, but because the work mattered more than her pride. Still, moments like this cut deep, not because of the grip at her throat, but because of how easily it had been justified. She finished what she came to do, corrected flawed protocols, pointed out weaknesses no one wanted to admit existed. Each word landed clean, undeniable. They listened with the intensity reserved for incoming fire. When she spoke of failure, it was not condemnation. It was instruction, survival wrapped in honesty. By the time she stepped back from the table, the room had changed completely. Authority had shifted without ceremony, not taken recognized. She gathered her things, movements unhurried. As she turned to leave, the officer found his voice at last. "We didn't know," he said, as if that explained anything. She paused at the door just long enough for the lesson to settle. "That," she replied softly, "has never stopped anyone before." And she walked out, leaving behind men who would never forget the weight of silence, or the woman who had mastered it. The corridor outside was colder, quieter, stripped of the performative confidence that filled the rooms behind reinforced doors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting pale reflections across the polished floor. Her footsteps echoed once, then disappeared into the vastness of the facility. She moved with the same steady rhythm she had always taught measured, intentional, conserving energy even when none seemed required. Inside the room she had left behind, no one spoke for a long moment. The absence of her presence felt heavier than her arrival. It forced reflection. Men who had survived combat, loss, and their own worst instincts now faced something far more uncomfortable. The realization that they had failed a moral test, not a tactical one. The man who had grabbed her stood alone near the wall, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He replayed the moment over and over, the certainty with which he had acted, the confidence that had justified violence without verification. He understood now that his mistake was not technical. It was personal. He had reduced her to a threat because it was easier than questioning his own authority. Across the facility, her name continued to ripple outward. Instructors murmured it with disbelief. Younger operators listened, eyes widening as stories connected to a living, breathing person they had nearly watched get dragged to the floor. She had been the voice behind the doctrine, the unseen standard against which they measured themselves. The idea that she could still be disrespected unsettled them deeply. She felt none of the satisfaction they imagined she might feel. Vindication was hollow. It always was. What lingered instead was fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying excellence in silence while others argued about who belonged where. The bruise on her throat throbbed faintly, a reminder that knowledge did not grant immunity. She stopped near a window overlooking the training grounds. Below, teams moved in tight formations, executing drills she had designed years earlier. She could predict their movements before they made them, could see the hesitation before mistakes happened. Her chest tightened, not with regret, but with responsibility. These lives mattered. They always had. That was why she endured rooms like the one she had just left. Behind her, footsteps approached, slower, more careful this time. The officer halted a respectful distance away. He did not try to assert rank. "They need to hear this," he said quietly. All of it, she kept her eyes on the field. They already did. He hesitated, then spoke the truth he could no longer avoid. "We failed you." She turned then, finally meeting his gaze fully. There was no accusation in her eyes, only clarity. "You failed yourselves," she said. "I walked away alive. That's not the measure." The weight of that settled between them. He understood now that the real damage had been done long before her arrival, done in habits, in assumptions, in the quiet permission given to disrespect when it wore the right uniform. When she resumed walking, It was toward the exit. Word spread quickly that she was leaving. Some wanted to stop her. Some wanted to apologize. None did. They understood instinctively that this was not a moment to demand forgiveness. As she passed through the final checkpoint, the guards stood straighter than they had for anyone all day. Not out of fear, but recognition. She acknowledged them with a slight nod, nothing more. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of dust and salt. The sky was beginning to darken, the kind of blue that promised night without drama. She inhaled deeply, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Tomorrow, the facility would continue operating, drills would run, missions would launch, but something fundamental had shifted. Inside those walls, silence would never feel the same again. She did not leave immediately. The car waited, engine cooling softly, but she stood for a moment beneath the open sky, letting the night settle around her like a final breath after a long hold. The facility behind her glowed with contained purpose, lights burning in windows where men would replay today's failure long after sleep should have come. She knew that look. She had worn it herself once when she learned that strength without humility was just another liability. Inside, the reckoning continued without her. Training schedules were quietly rewritten, protocols adjusted, language reconsidered, not because of policy, but because of shame. The most effective teacher had never raised her voice, never demanded acknowledgement. She had simply existed, and in doing so, exposed the cracks they had learned to ignore. The man who had grabbed her requested reassignment before dawn. No report demanded it. No punishment forced his hand. He understood now that leadership was not something you claimed. It was something you were judged worthy of every day, by the choices you made when power felt easiest to use. He would carry the memory of her calm longer than any reprimand. Weeks later, her influence surfaced in small, unmistakable ways. An instructor stopped a drill early, choosing correction over humiliation. A team leader asked a question instead of issuing an order. A young operator hesitated before acting on instinct alone, hearing a voice in his head reminding him to think, to breathe, to verify. None of them knew if she would ever return. It didn't matter. The standard had already been restored. As for her, she drove into the dark without ceremony. There were other places that needed her, other rooms where assumptions would be made, where respect would be withheld until proven unavoidable. She accepted that reality not with bitterness but resolve. Her work had never been about being seen. It was about what endured after she left. The bruise on her throat faded in time. The lesson did not. Somewhere in that facility, long after her name stopped being whispered, a truth remained etched into the culture like a scar beneath skin. The most dangerous person in the room is not always the loudest, the largest, or the one with authority. Sometimes it is the one who walks in quietly, already knowing exactly how to end the fight, and choosing instead to teach. And that choice, more than any display of force, is what saved lives.